Thank you for tuning in into Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Peter Magau Bul, and I'm a survivor. I want to first of all thank you, Sierra and Amanda, for inviting me to be part of today's conversation. I'm going to share my story as one of the children who were displaced from South Sudan back in the 80s. I came to America here and came as part of the group known as the Lost Boy of Sudan. So I'm going to do my presentation using the PowerPoint that I put together, and I hope you'll be able to enjoy it. I titled my presentation, Definition of a Champion, the journey of the mighty boys and girls of Sudan. We are known as Lost Boys, but the name Lost Boys came actually when we came to America, but before then we used to have different names. And yeah, so the picture you will see here is the picture of the Lost Boy when we crossed to Kenya in 1992. Next. Before Sudan got into the civil war, we used to live normally with our parents. The way our people live, our people were farmers. They keep cattle. As you could see from the picture here, you know, we are large farm where we grow crop. Our people build houses, as you will see from that picture. People have different role to play. For example, the one from the right, you would see those children who are standing on that structure. Their job was to scare away bird that would come and eat the crop. And some boys would take out cattle for grazings. So life was just simple. You know, we didn't have a school to go to, but we didn't have to worry about food to eat or anything. You know, things were just peaceful. Next. And yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, women have different roles. As you could see, the women, you know, they would build houses like the one you would see from the left. Everybody would be in the farm, whether you are children, your parent, you know, people would be in the farm during the day. And then in the evening, of course, people have normal stories to share with each other. So we are different crop that people grow. So it was just a simple life, and we were enjoying that time with our parents. Next. And so in Sudan, there is raining season and dry season. Normally between December and May, that is the dry season. So people would move away with their cattle. They will go to the Nile where there is water and grass, and they will stay there for those 6 months. And then in May, when the rain started, people would start moving back home, and that would be the time to do farming. So normally we keep cow because one person would probably own between 300 to 500 cow, and you know, you get milk from the cow. When a young man want to marry somebody daughter, of course, there's no way you could do it without paying 50 to 100 cow to the girl family. So farming and keeping cattle were mostly the way of survival. Next. That is River Nile. We live close to River Nile. It usually takes 2 to 3 days when you leave the village to go there. So as I mentioned earlier, during the dry season, all the cow would be collected from the village, and the boys and the young adult would move with their cow normally 2 to 3 days, and they will settle along the Nile where there is green grasses and water for the cow, and of course we'll do fishing and things like that, and we'll be there for 6 months. So once you are gone, you as a boy would have to leave your parent behind, and you would be gone for 6 months. So that 6 months, you would just survive on milk, on fish from the Nile, and of course people would go home, and if there is a need to get food from the village, of course people could go for 2 to 3 days and come back, and people would just stay there for those 5 months. Next. The picture you would see here on the left, These are the boy being initiated normally at the age of 12 to the age of 15. The boy would be initiated to become adult. So and when you have become adult, you have to know your role. Now you are no longer a boy, but a man who will have to take care of the village. You know, if there is a need to protect your people, that is normally your job as an adult. The picture from the right, these are, you know, young adult who would normally go to the cattle camp with the boys. And the common sport in South Sudan was wrestling. So there would be the competition normally between one cattle camp and the other, or one ethnic group and the other. So normally practice now in Juba, which is the capital of South Sudan, but that's the biggest sport in South Sudan. So life was just peaceful, normal, and people were just enjoying everything they have in their own land. Next. But then in 1988, the war in Sudan actually started way back in 1983. That war did not reach our village because I came from a state known as Wangulei. So in 1988, what I could remember, the government would come with the Russian-made antelope and they would drop bombs randomly from village to village. And that was the most scary part when that thing started. And then later on, of course, some villages were attacked and burned. And in 1987, I left the village and went to the cattle camp. So I was in the cattle camp from December to May. That year, there was a flood. River Nile was overflown. So on our way to the village, there was no need to go to the village because now the water took over the place. So we had to move to a high ground where we stay for another 6 months. So from that December 1987 to the December of the following year, I was gone, never had a chance to be with my family. So on our way back in December of 1988, it was the time that you know, most of our villages were under attack, and of course there were recruitment from the Sudanese Liberation Army that was fighting the government in the north. And so as for that reason, I had to leave the village. And I remember I started the journey with my mom in December of 1988. That was the time I left my family at the age of 7. Next. So our journey, I think you skip one slide if I'm not mistaken. So actually the cause of war could be summarized into, you know, historical factors. As some of you probably know, Sudan was colonized by the British when the whole continent was colonized. So British were in charge from 18 something all the way to 1956. So when Sudan got independent on January 1st, 1956, they then handed over to the Northerners, which were predominantly Muslim and Arab. So now when they were in charge, they want to have access to oil in the south. And so for them to do that, they have to displace people from their own land. And as I mentioned earlier, our people were cattle keepers and they have farm. So for them to be displaced from their own land just because the government want to have access to oil, that was actually one cause of the war. The other one was identity factors such as religion and race. Religion was being used as a tool to mobilize people. In the north, again, those of us from the south, because in the north, you are predominantly Muslim. So for the government to get support, they have to lie to them that, you know, we are fighting Christian in the south. Also in the south, you have Black African. So those who are a mixture of Arab and African, they would use race as a factor to mobilize the rest from Northern Sudan to fight us in the south. Of course, political and social factors such as bad governance, dictatorship, and corruption, which exist both now in Northern and South Sudan, were also cause of that war. Next. So our journey started in December of 1988. That was the year I left. Some children actually left way before me. Some left in 1986, others in 1987. But I left the village in 1988. And South Sudan is a very huge country. So there were children who had to work for 3 months to get to Ethiopia. For me, it probably took me about 1 month or a little more because my village is closer to Ethiopia, then the children who were to cross the Nile and had to pass through our villages and walk to Ethiopia. The reason most of us end up in Ethiopia, it was probably, as I mentioned earlier, the SPLM also had an agenda of trying to recruit children in the village and send them to Ethiopia with the hope that some of these children would be later trained and sent back to fight on their behalf. So there was that hidden agenda, but we as children had no clue. So that's probably the reason why when we left the village and majority of children collect themselves from village to village, we were being instructed, to hit that direction, which some of us as kids have no idea where we were going to that time. Next. So as you could see from the picture here, that was us back in the 80s. You could tell some of us had no shoes. The kid behind there who is carrying a jerkin, we used to, if there was any river we find, you would go and fill up those jerkin, and one boys or the rest of the group would have to carry that water for everyone. Because we were walking in the desert, it was dry, there was no water. So what we used to do, we would hide under the tree during the day, and it started our journey like 7 p.m. at night when it is dark. Because if you walk during the day, there were two problems. One, if a government see a crowd of children moving, they would drop bomb, and many of the children might die. So it was convenient to hide during the day and walk at night when it is dark. Walking during the day too, it was dry, there was no water, and thirsty was the problem. So it was convenient also to hide during the day and walk at night. Walking at night too was not that convenient, because many of the children who get exhausted, they would give up and they would go and lie down, and if nobody seen them, they may be left behind. So, but then we then organize ourselves, and we have to keep looking at one another, who is missing, who is with the group. But yeah, that was our journey. It took me personally 1.5 months, but for others, it took them 3 months to reach Ethiopia. So it was not easy journey. 3 months or 1 month later, when we end up in Ethiopia, there was nobody there for us. So we had to figure out what to do by ourselves. So when we get there, what we had to do, we organize ourselves into group of 50, group of 100 to 1,000. And then leaders were assigned to group. And when you are chosen by your group as a leader, for example, me being one of those leaders, you become like a parent to these children, meaning you would be the one to decide if we lost number of children, who are going to bury them. Since there was no food, if we have to go to the forest and look for something to eat, you would have to assign some children to go and look for that food. If we want to build our houses, because we used to sleep under the tree in the open, and when it rained sometime, that was a problem. So we had to also build houses, not a good one, but anything you could build, just to to sleep in. And so those were some of the assignment group leaders would have to do. Of course, kids at the age of 7 to the age of 12, it was not something they could do, but we didn't have choice. In the picture you would see there, the container you would see there was what we used to cook whatever we have. So whenever we cook something in that container, you, the group leader, would have to make sure every kid have something to eat. In the evening, we'll come and sit together, and we'll have other children, just to entertain the rest of the group. For example, the one carrying a guitar, if you know how to play guitar, you could just do it. If you have joke to share with the group, you would do that. But the reason we used to do that was to distract ourselves from the problem that we were facing as children who were taken away from their parents. Next. So our daily activities, as I mentioned, was you, the group leader, some children would go and fetch for water, firewood to cook. If we lost number of children, we would have to carry the dead bodies to the cemetery and bury those children. We came from a culture, a society where children at that age would never do the burying. But when we were by ourselves, we have to honor them and we have to do that job. So that was a tough job for those of us who were leaders, just to have children who, who have nothing to eat with empty stomach to go and do such a heavy job. It was tough. But then when you are asked to do something, you just have to do whatever it takes to make sure uh, we take care of ourselves as people. So some of the kids would go to the forest and they would have to look for things to eat. And the good thing with us was that we came from different ethnic groups. So if there was kind of vegetation or something that one group eat, and we see other children from another ethnic group eating it, and then we'll join in and have to eat that one in order to survive. So that was the life in Ethiopia. For those of us who got there in 1986, of course, we stayed there from 86, 88, all the way to 91 when Sudan got it into its old civil war. Next. So as I mentioned earlier, the SPLM, the Sudan Liberation Army, that was fighting the government in the north, they have also their own agenda. So when we got to Ethiopia, they named us the Red Army. And most of us, regardless how young you were, we were given some training just to be ready. And I remember those days, after the training, which usually take about 6 months or 1 year, the SPLM would come to the camp and they will voluntarily ask children who want to go back to South Sudan. So I remember those days, people like myself who have the height, we just want to leave the camp by all means, because you would ask yourself, do I need to die here idle, or should I go back and join the military and die as a hero, fighting, defending my village, defending the country, or trying to liberate my people? So during those days, we were brainwashed to a point where we just want to join the military by all means. So, but they will select the older one, probably at the age of 12 and above, and they will take them back to South Sudan. But the younger one, you would be discouraged, and they would tell us, just go to school over here. Maybe in the next 2-3 years, we will come back, and if you want to join the army, we will take you. So when we got to Ethiopia, of course, we represent different ethnic groups, and it was difficult to communicate. So we have to figure out how to communicate with one another. One thing we used to do too, we used to mix ourselves every year, and the goal was to create unity among us. So you as a kid would be a roommate to kid from another ethnic group, and you become brothers and sisters. And that's what we used to do. And it worked well, because most of us, Arabic was then official language of Sudan. So we were encouraged to learn Arabic so that we could have one unifying language to communicate, and then English come later. So that was the life back in Ethiopia those days. Next. So the person in the picture was Dr. John Grant. Dr. John Grant was educated here in the United States, went back to South Sudan, and found the Sudan People Liberation Army, and he started the war against the North. So he is considered the founding father of South Sudan. So when he used to come and visit us in Ethiopia, he would come every year. He would come and tell us why we are not in our own country. And he would tell us, we might fight this war for 30, 40 years, but you would encourage us, there has to be a generation to take over that struggle. So you would tell us, go to school wherever you go, and just do whatever it takes to take care of one another. And he would tell us the history of Sudan, why we were not in Sudan, but in Ethiopia. So that's, and he would come with other SPLM leaders, just to come and share that part of the history. Next. So in 1991, it was during the Cold War between Russia, the United States, and other countries. So for that reason, the government that was in charge was overthrown, and now we have a new government in charge. And that new government didn't want us in Ethiopia, so they start, attacking us from the 3 places we were in. So we had to run away from Ethiopia. and we didn't have choice but to run towards Sudan. So when we start moving back to Sudan, the government of Sudan knew that now the refugee or the children who were in Ethiopia now were on their way back to Sudan. So now they start sending the troop toward that direction too. Before we got to Sudan, though, we are River Gilo, that we had to cross. It was during the rainy season, it was May. And so that river was overflown because of the rain. And so when we got to that river, it was difficult to cross that river, even if you know how to swim. You could see water moving with its feet. You know, that water would uproot trees somewhere, and you would see trees and branch moving with the water. And now when you come to that river, you would have to decide, would you go back to Ethiopia with the child that you would be killed by the Ethiopian army that were chasing us or be captured by them, or would you try to cross that river? And if you cross it, then you have to face the Sudanese enemy on the other side. So we have three situations to deal with: the water, the Ethiopian army, and the Sudanese government on the other side. But most of us managed to cross the river, and we settled at the border. But few months later, of course, we didn't have food. Everything was a struggle the sooner we got there. But as people who have survived in many areas, you know, it was not something we compared to when we first went to Ethiopia. So we knew what to do if we go to the forest and find something to eat, you know, so we were pretty much aware of what to do. But then the Sudanese government came, and Pachala, that was the town mother of the Lost Boy, to settle in, was attacked and captured by the Sudanese army. That forced us to run away from Pachala and another place called Fakuk. And now, instead of going to our villages, we walk at the border. The Red Cross came to our rescue. So some were transported from one place to the other until we arrived at a place called Kafoida. So when we arrived in Kafoida, which is in Eastern Sudan, the Sudanese government would every day bomb people. And it was the most scary thing because we would dig holes or bunkers to hide in. But sometimes you just don't know whether that bomb would drop on you. So those few days we were in Kafota was really tough. So we moved to another place called Nairus, near the border of Sudan and Kenya. But then Sudanese government was following us, so we had to cross to Kenya in 1992. And that was the time we came to a place called Kakuma Refugee Camp in Northern Kenya. So as you could see from the arrow there, from the time we left Penyendu to the border of Sudan and Ethiopia, and then we had to move again to a place called Nairus, and then finally move to Kenya, to a place known as Kakuma, as you could just follow that arrow. Next. So when we came to Kakuma, most of us now were between the age of 10 and 15 or older, because we have been in Ethiopia for 4 years. So we had to start the life in Kakuma. It's a desert place. So when we come, we didn't have houses, so we would sleep in the open. The UN start bringing some building material. They would distribute them, and we start building our houses. We start going to school there. Most of our classrooms were under the tree, as you could see there. So every morning we would wake up and then go to those trees and sit down, and the teachers would have to write something on the blackboard. We didn't have exercise book, so you sit on the floor, you label the soil, you write ABCDs on the soil, because soil now was your exercise book. So that's how we start learning. In Kakuma, there was shortage of food, of course. There were also refugees that joined us later from Rwanda when the Rwanda genocide took place in 1994. There were refugees from Ethiopia itself. There was also refugees from Somalia and Burundi. Those later came, but who were the first to settle in Kakuma. And now Kakuma is one of the biggest camps in northern Kenya that house refugees from the region, not just from Sudan, but from the countries that I mentioned. So yeah, so we settled. We started our classes there, being taught under the tree. Next. So Kakuma was better because some of the UN, like the World Food Program, the UNHCR, they later came and they divide the job among themselves. There were agencies that were responsible for education. Some were just distribute food to the refugee. The food was only distributed for 14 days. So you would only get a small cup of coin. And I remember those days, you would have to put your ratio together and you would have to budget. So you would cook maybe one day. If you choose evening to cook, then you don't have to worry about breakfast and lunch. You would have to wait to eat something later as a dinner, and then you would have to wait for next day. But there was time where you would run out of that food, and you could go for 2 to 3 days without eating. In the picture here, we didn't have teachers too, so we used to teach ourselves. So if you are a smart student from class 7, and you could go and teach at class 1 at your own free time when you are not in class. So as you could see those children, that's how we started learning in Kakuma, and things start to improve as we move from under the tree to a classroom. That's how we started our education there. Next. So we stay in Kakuma for 9 years. When we left Ethiopia, there was more than 20,000 children. By the time we came to Kakuma 4 years later, there was about 14,000 who survived and made it to Kakuma. So when the news of coming to America reached us in Kakuma in 1998, 99, we could not believe it, that it was going to happen. But anyway, all the children were asked to write their own history. So you would be asked to write a one-page essay about where are your parents, what happened to you, and all that. So you would write it and give it to them. And then later, the American who would come with that note that you have written. They would come and interview you just to make sure your history is accurate. So that process took about 2 years. But we were all given a chance to do the interview, but the US was only looking for a small number. So at the end of your interview, and you would be given an envelope, and that envelope has either a rejection letter or a acceptance letter. So when you open that envelope and you are accepted, you would celebrate, you would go back home and celebrate with your group and with your family. When you are rejected, you would see some children crying that now they were missing. And it just depends on how you convince them or what you share with them, because they wanted to make sure they bring people who are going to do well in America, to take care of themselves and be able to think about what they have to do back to help other refugees. So yeah, so that process took about 2 years. Next. So as I mentioned earlier, the United States was looking for about 4,000. So about 3,800 came to the United States between 2000 and 2001. There was only 89 girls among us, because when we were in the camp, some of the girls who were with us, they were taken to host families, and boys were left by themselves. So when the process started, it started with the boys, and the girls were with few families that were in the camp. There was also resistance from the community about, they weren't sure about whether people would come back. And as I mentioned from the beginning, when you have a daughter, somebody would have to marry that daughter, and you would have to get the wealth in return in form of cow and money and so forth. So in our culture too, you don't want to let your daughter go far away from you, because when somebody come and marry her, you would get cow or money or whatever that young man would paid to the girl family in form of bride price. So yeah, so that's why there was that's why majority of the children who came to America were mostly boys. Over 10,000 remain in Kakuma, and some of them are still there 30 years later. Some moved back to South Sudan after the independence in July of 2011. Some lost boys went to Australia, and some went to Canada. Australia later started taking not just the lost boy, but families as well. So now you are majority of South Sudanese also in Australia. Okay? So when we came to the United States, we were so excited because what we heard about America was that life is easy in America. You could have a job, you could do anything to live a better life. But when we came here, of course, we had to learn the language. We have to learn how to eat American food. We came from where it was always 100 degrees to a place like Chicago where you would have to face snow. So transportation itself, moving from one part of the city to another, those were challenges we had to face first because we left the village and live in a refugee camp, but we never had a chance to live in a big city like Chicago. So this challenges, I mean, we were afraid. How do we adjust to American life? There was that frustration, and of course, some of the children now from refugee came to America, and you wonder even whether you would have a chance even to see your parents if they survived the war. So things like that caused disappointment, but there were not challenges you would compare to what we went through, when we walked to Ethiopia and then in those refugee camps. But the good news was that most of the lost boys who were selected out to come to America, they came with some goal in mind. Some of us want to make sure we educate ourselves. As our leader, Dr. John Graham, used to tell us, educate yourself wherever you go, because you would be the people to take over the struggle some days. And we wanted to make sure we also create a relationship between the United States and South Sudan. And we'll do that by going to different places, to share our history and be able to mobilize Americans and tell them the need to stop the war in Sudan. And some of us started a non-profit organization to be able to help back home. We came to United States. You will live in the US for 5 years, and after that you could apply for citizenship. And so we are dual citizens. We both citizens of America and South Sudan now. Majority of us, especially those of us who came as part of that refugee settlement. Next. So as you could see from the picture here, one of our goals was to go to the Capitol Hill, for example, to go and engage the US senators and congressmen and women. Richard Loga in the picture there, he was one of the US representative who visited us in Ethiopia during the 80s. And when he met us in Ethiopia as children, I know it was the first time to see someone who looked different from us. So as kids, we used to run after them and sing, welcome, welcome, American Congressman. We didn't even know what congressman mean. But yeah, it was somebody who had a chance to visit us back in the 80s. So when we came to the United States and had a chance to meet him in 2006 at the Capitol Hill, he became one of our big supporter, so along with former senator from Indiana, Richard Lugat, and many others. So one of the way we had to raise awareness was just to go and engage with them at the Capitol Hill. Next. We would also go to the UN during the United Nations General Assembly, and that was the time all the world leaders would come to New York. So we'll engage some African leaders as well as American leaders from different parts of the world. So our presence in the United States really helped because that was the time we engaged the Bush administration, and the Bush administration took it upon itself that they have to end the war in Sudan. And so back in 2002, they negotiated the peace agreement that later led to independence of South Sudan in July of 2011. So without the Lost Boy in America, probably would have not even had a chance to have what we now call our country, regardless of what is happening there right now. So it was our coming to the United States here, because the good thing in the United States, once you mobilize the grassroots population, the American, and educate them enough to understand why there was war in that part of the world, the American in return would engage the leaders and they will tell them, you would have to intervene at some point and be able to do something. That only happens when people are informed and mobilized enough to be able to do rallies and do whatever it takes to engage the leader to do even something they don't want to do. Next. So other ways we would do it was to go to different school, to speak to students. And one thing I have learned in the United States here, once you engage a student, it's just from middle school to high school, they would take it seriously that, they would have conversation with their parents and, and do whatever it takes, just to make sure the politicians, whether they are their senators or representative or people who are lawmakers at different level, so it's one way, just to make sure the politician really got the message. So, and that was the commitment I made since I came to the US. I would go to different schools, to different synagogues, to different churches, to different places, just to share my history and tell them the need to end the war in that part of the world. The one in the picture here, late Manute Bol, probably most of you know him. He was the first South Sudanese to play in the NBA. When he came to the US here, he was the one person really starting with the Clinton administration and the administration before Clinton administration, you would tell them they need for the US government to intervene in Sudan. But since he was one person, he couldn't really, people couldn't listen to him. So when we came to the US, as somebody we consider a hero, we joined up with him, and we used to do that. Manute actually visited us when we ran away from Ethiopia in 1991, and he used the money he made from the NBA to buy food and blanket, and he brought them to us when we were at the border of Sudan and Ethiopia. And then in 1993, he went to Kakuma Refugee Camp too, and it was the first time I actually met him. And so he was somebody who was helping in different areas. So when we came to the US, we joined up to him, and it made it easy for him, just to let the American people know that the war has to end at some point. Next. It took me 20 years to see my my family. I left in 1988. In October of 2007, I applied for my US citizenship, and then I get it. And after that, I decided it was time for me to go back and see my family. So I left Chicago here in December of 2007, arrived at the village in January of 2008. So that was 20 years later. So when I came home to the place of my birth, I was welcomed by the children, as you see in the picture there. And I was happy to see my family. I was able to reunite with my mom, my brothers and sister. The only person I couldn't unite with was my father, who passed away in 91, the year that we ran away from Ethiopia. So that was the person I couldn't see. My mom passed away 2 years later in 2010, but that was after I seen her twice. And so when I was in the village, I went there with the intention just to see my family. But these children from the village welcomed me, and they gave me a message that when you go back to the United States, please talk to your friend, talk to the lost boys and girls who are there, that we want to go to school. So I took those pictures, not knowing exactly what to do, but I took their message and brought it back and shared it with the other lost boy and American. And so yeah, so when I came back, I started talking to mostly lost boys who are from that village, and we form a non-profit organization, and we start contributing money. We registered that as the 501c3, and then we begin reaching out to, to American, mostly students that I used to go and speak to at middle school, high school, and begin to raise some money. And then in some years later, we went back with other lost boy, and we started the construction of that school, because most of us believe even if the war in Sudan ends, the struggle would still be there until you educate the next generation to understand that they are blessed with resources in their own country. And it's only people who are educated who know their right, so otherwise it's easy now in South Sudan to go and mobilize youth and tell them we are fighting Dinka, we are fighting Nuer, we are fighting this ethnic group, and they will not ask politicians, why are we fighting? But with education, you would be able to find out first, are you fighting on, on behalf of that politician, or is there real reason for you to take up arms and fight people who don't speak the same language as you? So we knew in the long term, if things have to change in South Sudan, we would have to also educate the next generation. So we started that school, and different lost boys were doing different things. For example, a friend of mine or a cousin of mine named John Dow started his foundation, and he built one of the best medical clinics back there. And some were also digging wells in the village. So Lost Boy have really contributed at different levels. But that was something I was a part of as a result of me visiting the village in 2008. Next. So when I came back, actually, I met this young girl from the Chicago Sinai congregation in downtown Chicago. It's in the Jewish tradition, when you are turning 14, of course, you would have to choose a charity and raise money. So this young girl, Elijah, was with her sister, Mark Julian from Saint Sabina on the south side of Chicago. They decided that they were going to raise money, specifically to buy a uniform. So Elijah and her sister raised about 20,000, and so they also contribute to that project back in 2008. And there was a school and many places that were supporting that project as a result. Next. And girl education was not taken seriously in South Sudan because I think most of our parents, they know once your daughter get married, you would have to move out of the family and go to a husband family. So for that reason, they don't really invest in girl education compared to how they do it with the boys. But as I mentioned Elijah and her sister earlier, I was there in the village telling them, look, the people who even raise this money, most of them are women, they are girls. So I used to tell them there is no reason that you cannot sell girls to school. And I used to tell them, I'm doing this just because I wanted to help. So if you're not gonna send boys to school, there's no reason. I could even just stop doing it and so forth. So with that pressure, in our school, you could find equal number of boys and girls, which is something you rarely see it in South Sudan. So that was also part of our campaign. Next. Yeah, we also knew once we get independent, we know the politicians will not stop confusing our people. So, and unfortunately, that is the situation South Sudan is in today because of the power struggle between the president who came from the Dinka, the largest ethnic group, and the vice president who came from the second largest group. In 2013, they got into power struggle. And that power struggle takes South Sudan back to war, just because of disagreement between these two people. And in South Sudan, where people are not educated, it was easy for them to mobilize people along the ethnic line. And so before that happened, actually, we had a conversation and we say, I think we should be part of the nation building, especially making sure we have peace in that country. So we came up with this idea, what we call Peace of Neighbors. So, and we chose Wangulei State, because Wangulei State have ethnic groups that have been fighting each other for years. So when we went back, we had to make sure we go to all these places and talk to the youth, to the chief, to different people. And we used to tell them, look, you now have a country. You are people of one nation, regardless of how different you are in terms of ethnic group. So we used to talk to them with the hope that, that would help. Unfortunately, it did not help, but at least people got our message clearly when we used to go to those villages. It was a difficult job because, as you know, in South Sudan, there are no roads. So even moving from one village to the other, it was tough. And we were also afraid of our life. Although when we went back, we were Lost Boy, who were united, who happened to be from those ethnic groups, for example, Nuer and Dinka. We will go together, stood in front of them, and tell them, look, we came from America. We are a mixture of Nuer and Dinka. We get along so well. We do everything together. We are brothers and sisters. We want you to live in the way we live in the US. That was the message of peace would bring to them. Next. So we try our best to do that between 2011 and 2012 before South Sudan got into its own war in 2013. So as you could see from the picture here, there were times would be given soldiers to escort us from one village to the other. You would see there some of our car would stuck in the mud and would come out, push that car out. We got back into it and then go from place to place. So it was not easy, but we wanted South Sudan to be in peace. That was the reason why we want to make sacrifice, because knowing what we have been through as children and how we survived and be blessed to be in America, we wanted to give back in different ways. One way was to make sure there is peace in our homeland. We make sure we also help by educating the next generation, bringing clean water to the village. So we are different commitment because we just want to make sure if American has given us, the best that we have got, we want to also make sure we extend that to the country, to our native country. Next. So we used to go with also eye doctors. The cousin I mentioned earlier, he has a foundation called John Dow Foundation. So there were doctors from Utah who would volunteer themselves. They will come to the village. In South Sudan, like people who have been blind or couldn't see for some years, when we bring them together and they remove cataract, we'll tell them, look, if you live in peace, Americans are very generous people. They will come and give their services. And to them, it was a miracle that somebody who have not seen for some years now could see again. And we tie that to peace. We used to call it peace dividend. So we used to do that until South Sudan get into the war in 2013. And of course, because of the insecurity, the politicians even don't like us there. That is slow us down from doing what we love to do to have back home there. Next. So those are the pictures of the Lost Boys. We went back in 2011, between 2011 and 2012. We, of course, we are no longer boys, but gentlemen who are educated, we have Lost Boys who are PhD holders. We have Lost Boys who are doctors or of different profession, and some run different NGOs. So those were the pictures when we went back home. I'm somewhere there among them. And the one in the red from the right is John Dow. He's in a movie called God Grew Tired of Us, for those who have watched that documentary. Next. We also have a Sudanese community center here in Chicago. When Luol Deng was drafted by the Chicago Bull in 2004, he also joined up with us and he wanted to help in different ways. And Luol actually was the one sponsoring our birthday parties here in Chicago and doing everything to support us. So we had a Sudanese community center here in Chicago. We have one now on the north side of Chicago, which on Lawrence and Broadway. We no longer do activities as we used to do because many of the Lost Boys now are parents taking care of their wife and children and working. But yeah, that was what we have in Chicago. We receive leaders from South Sudan. We would also hold them there at the Sudanese Community Center. In fact, we went to Illinois Holocaust Museum some years ago. Our vice president visited us there. And and we were there. And I think you are all, for those who are from Holocaust Museum, you are familiar with Harris, who is standing with me in the picture there. So yeah, so that's we've been trying to help ourselves here in Chicago as well. Next. So those were pictures taken from the Holocaust Museum when we took the bike president there, and some at the Sudanese Community Center, as you could see there. Next. Yeah, I just want to leave you with some lesson, share that story. Yeah, so I think you could just go there, more than just one. But yeah, these are, I think, like I titled this presentation, definition of a champion. I believe it is never easy to survive from all the places that we have been without any kind of support. So not giving up was one of the reasons we couldn't. I remember when we used to work at night, there was a competition that if you remain behind, some of the children who arrive first, they will line up and they will wait for other kids. And they will make fun of you. Why are you the late person to show up? So fear was the biggest things. I remember those days, when you see children dying every day, you would ask yourself whether you would be the next person. But you have to overcome that fear. But what helped us the most was the hope and faith and the love that we had to take care of one another. And yeah, so we knew we had to leave our parents behind, not because of our choice, but because of the war. So sometimes, when you are in a situation like that, you would have to do whatever it takes, to take care of yourself. And that is exactly what we have done as a Lost Boys. Next. So these are some of the things, as I mentioned: commitment, competition. Those of us who were chosen as a leader, it was not a choice you would make. If your group trusts you and pick you to be a leader, you would just have to do whatever it takes. I remember those days. The advantage for those of us who were leaders is that if you are trusted to be the person doing that job, you don't even think about your own problem. Whatever occupies your mind is, what are you going to do to these children? So that itself, it empowers you not to even think about your own challenges. And as I live in Chicago today, I have my own challenges, but most of the time, that's not what occupies my mind. What occupies my mind is, what am I going to do to the country that has been in mess all these years? What is it that I need to do to the lost boy who are with me here? So I hope what I share could help you in some form, and you could use this history to be a voice for others. As you all know, Sudan or South Sudan is not the only country in war right now. There are many countries that are in war. And those of us who are blessed to live in a peaceful country like the United States, of course, we had our own problem here in the country. But, I'm always proud of anything because I know what I've been through. So if there are issues in Chicago here, as a citizen of this country, I always make sure I also speak up and be part of the solution. So next. So I want to leave you with this quote from from Dr. King. Quote: if you can fly, then run. If you can run, then walk. If you can walk, then crown. But whatever you do, keep moving. I think this quote resonates well with the lost boys and girls because that is actually what that was our mindset, when we walk from country to country and live in those refugee camps next. And then I have another one from Nelson Mandela, who was in prison for 27 years in South Africa, came out and became the president of South Africa and give up power when his term ended. So he had this quote: I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the trauma by it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but who conquered that fear. As I mentioned earlier, we were all often afraid to a point where you just don't know whether you would be the next person to die or not. But of course, at the end of the day, you would have to be brave enough because you just don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Here we are in the United States. Who knew we would survive and be here today? doing things to help others. But God help in different ways, and you have to help God too by making sure fear does not. Uh, uh, it's not an obstacle in your life. Next. So yeah, so that's all I could share with you, and I think we can now open it up for question. That is the picture when I first visit my family or visit those students. That I think that was from my second trip when I went with the exercise book and distribute them to the students. So thank you for taking time, and now let's open it up for question.
Thank you so much, Peter. We do have a couple questions. The first one was, were there any aid organizations to assist you and displaced children when you were in the refugee camps?
Yeah, when in the 80s, when we first went to Ethiopia, there were no aid agencies that came to our rescue. It was just, we had to take care of ourselves. And when we got to Ethiopia, the Ethiopians were generous, but of course, in many places in Africa, people are struggling, and there were so many children that even if Ethiopians who were generous could help, there was no way they could help that many children, but there were no aid agencies. It's it was after a year or some month later that aid agency like the Red Band or the UNICEF or the Red Cross let us show up, and then they begin to distribute blanket and food. And it was during our second journey when we left Ethiopia, heading back to Sudan to Kenya. That's exactly when we have the Red Cross, and they used to transport the younger one, the people who are sick, and then the rest, of course, would walk. But they were helping as we moved from Ethiopia to Kenya. And when we came to Kakuma, that's when we have many international aid agencies like the UNHCR, the World Food Program. So yeah, but that was later in 1992. But the beginning of our journey from our village to Ethiopia, there was absolutely nothing. It was just taking care of one another.
You said it was 20 years before you went back. What was it like that first time?
To be honest, when I left Chicago here, I was really very excited that I'm finally going home. And I left Chicago here. When I arrived at the village, when I left the village, we used to have a large farm where we grow crops. We have many cows. So my family was really very rich. We have two homes. One place we just focus on farming. The other second home, that's where we keep cows during the rainy season, and then we take them to the cattle camp. When I arrived at the village, it was just a desert. There was no farm because people have been displaced year after year. So they really gave up farming because of that displacement. And just going back and see the struggle my family were in, that was something I really felt bad. But I was very excited too that at least I have a chance to unite with my mother and the rest of my brothers and sisters. So I had a mixed feeling. And of course, when I visit the place where these children were taught under the tree, their expectation that I was there to help them, but I went there just to see my family. And so, I was just wondering, what is it that I'm gonna do really with their message? But, I was lucky enough when I came back, other lost boys and girls understood the importance of us helping back in the village there. And when we extend that message to the American, I got help as I described from the picture earlier. So overall, I was very excited to go back home, but I wasn't pleased with what I see, especially the destruction that has taken place over the period of 20 years' time.
And what is it like today when you go back?
Well, when South Sudan get back into the conflict in 2013, most of the people who left refugee camp and want to go back to their own country, that now we have a country that they knew it would be peaceful and people could start over their life. They were disappointed when the war started again in 2013, and most of them had no choice but to move back to a refugee camp. So almost all of my family are back to Kenya right now, just because of the fear of being killed. And that is a very huge disappointment to many of the Lord boys who have committed themselves and do everything to help back home. Now we have leaders who don't care about the people other their own needs. We have now the most corrupted leaders in the world running that country. And we just don't get it. How could people make a sacrifice to fight the Northern Sudan for a period of 20 years that they want to liberate their people, that they want freedom for their people and so forth. And all of a sudden, they become the worst leaders now, even compared to those who were in power in, in Northern Sudan. But human beings are human. Without a system of accountability and everything, people become anything they could be. So South Sudan is not in a better shape right now, but we know, it's a young country. We will have to do whatever it takes to make sure people go back home. But as of now, many people are in a refugee camp. Some moved to Juba, which is the capital city of South Sudan. They are not fighting at the moment, but then, there are no services that this government has been delivering to the people. So, and the insecurity have uprooted people. The war of 2013 that just ended. Now they have a unity government that they are trying to implement the peace that was signed, but implementation of that peace is it's a huge struggle now, and we don't see that country getting out of its mess until we have a new generation taking over from them. But that is not going to be easy. Now, even when I go to South Sudan, many of these government officials, they don't like me for the fact that I speak up against their, the problem that they have caused and so forth. So, but it's a country. We belong to that country. I was there in January. I was in Juba because I went there to get married. So even people were telling me not to go there, but I had to go there because I'm not a problem to anybody other than just to make sure we have a better country for everyone.
When you were in Kakuma, did you ever feel forgotten about or wonder where the rest of the world was in assisting?
When we were in Kakuma, we really didn't know who is with us and who was not with us, and we did not understand the politics to the extent that we know most of the country would act based on their interests. So in Kakuma, we just want to survive. We were not into politics. So it's only until I came to the United States, went to school, and be able to understand why some countries sometimes are slow to intervene in another countries. And when you now see, like over the years, China is the bigger export of oil in Sudan. So if China is taking oil from Sudan, they care less about the war in that country. All they are interested in is to get that oil. If Russia, for example, is selling arms to Sudan, all they care about is the business between the government that they are selling arms to and whatever they are receiving in return. And the same could apply to the United States. For example, when we first came here, we learned that many companies were investing in Sudan. And so what we had to do was to make sure many of these companies have to divest their money, because if you are giving that money to the government, that government is using your money to go and buy arms and kill people. So all these things, we could not understand them when we were in a refugee camp, but when we came to the US, we understand that they call it the Sudanese war, that Sudanese are fighting themselves, but there were many other countries that were contributing to the war in Sudan in different ways. And that is a complicated business you would see with other war being fought in different countries today. Take, for example, Congo, with the minerals that are there, of course, other countries are benefiting from it and people are dying, people are fighting themselves, and you would say, oh, these people are fighting themselves. These are the things we came to understand when we came to the United States. Go to school, be able to read book and do your own research.
One last question is, what is one kind of major lesson or takeaway you want people to have from hearing your story?
Well, one of the most important things is to, I'm sharing this story today, but I know there are people out there who will say, oh, we heard this story many times. Of course, some of you probably heard it many times, but the problem is still there. The genocide is still taking place in some part of the world. So raising awareness is not some people's job, but if we care enough as human beings, I think we have to keep reminding ourselves, what happened over the years. We talk about the Holocaust. It's happened those days, but this is what is actually still happening today. So I think my message to the people is that, it is never easy nowadays, to be part of the solution, because we get distracted by many things, and we just focus on our life and don't even see whether any contribution we could do would make a difference. But we are blessed to be alive, and when you are alive, you just have to be part of the solution. You have to be part of something, starting within the community where you live in. We have problem here in Chicago. We always talk about the issue of police brutality here in the United States and other issues. You got to be part of something. That's my message to the people. So if you are one of the people listening to me today, please be part of the solution. And we are raising awareness this month because the genocides are still happening in some part of the world. And we have to have this conversation, and we have to remind ourselves about what our role should be as people.
I had one more question just come in. Can you recommend any resources to learn more about Sudan?
Well, there are books written by the Lost Boys. For example, there is a book called What is the What? That book is there. At middle school and high school, we have Long Walk to Water, written by Salfadud. He's one of the Lost Boys. There is a documentary called God Grew Tired of Us by John Dow. So there are that tool out there, and of course, everything is available on the internet nowadays. But those are a few books and documentaries that I could refer to you. And and it's just a matter of being interested. But anytime you hear somebody, whether someone from Rwanda, from Burundi, from Sudan, once you hear that country, that there is a problem in that country, and you really want to educate yourself, there's enough information out there that you would be able to really know what you can know and be part of the solution. The problem is just the willingness to be able to be part of something that is just bigger than your own personal need.
That is all the questions we have today. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Well, thank you again for tuning in. Join us next Wednesday, April 21 at 10 a.m. Central Time to hear Craig Bidian, a second-generation Armenian American and grandson of Armenian genocide survivors, who would share his grandfather's story. So keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum Facebook page and other social media accounts where we will post a stream content through the week ahead. Thank you for your support during this extraordinary time. I'm Peter Bulls, and thank you.